Hille, who is coming in from as the Director of Solutions Marketing for Nintex. Erik, real pleasure to have you with us. We're excited about you talking about let's get back to work. How do we establish a process framework to enable our return to work plans? Thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your wisdom and expertise with our global audience today.
Thank you, Jose. I appreciate that. I'm going to make sure I capture a little recording of you saying I have wisdom and expertise so I can share it with my kids. So I genuinely appreciate the warm welcome. And folks, thank you all for taking a little time out of your day this morning to sit down and talk about this topic. For me, returning to work and the impact that that we have seen COVID have over the past couple of years, and adapting to that is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart. So I'm hoping that we can spend a little bit of time today doing a couple of things. First of all, get this to advance. We'll talk a little bit about, in essence, the risks of returning to work. Right? And the risks, when we think about that, obviously there are health concerns, and I'm sure that comes top of mind for everybody else. But we also have an amazing backdrop of regulations and guidelines and people's attitudes that we're going to have to consider as we step forward in this new world. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the complicated dynamics that these processes kind of take on, where you can focus to actually drive adaptability for your organization, make sure that you can be flexible and meet the needs of the most employees that you can. How automation is, it says helps here, but I really think of it as a critical component of being flexible and nimble in the face of an environment that's constantly changing. And then, obviously we'll talk just a little bit about, what Nintex could do kind of in that role. I promise not to turn this into a huge commercial for you folks, though. I really would like to keep this focused on the thought leadership space, focused on the issues that our new working style has pushed us towards. So, in light of that, I think we'll start with a little shock and awe. Returning to work right now, when we think about that, opening up the offices, let's say 3 times a week, 4 times a week, is something that is inherently risky for companies. Now, this is happening against the backdrop of a lot of executives wanting to return to the office at least 3 times a week. But at the same time, when we look at the employees' reaction, it's not the same. Whereas the executive level of our organizations is almost overwhelmingly interested in bringing us back to work. Really, only about a third of the employees feel the same way. And we'll talk a little bit about the different dynamics there and how different employees have different needs in just a moment. Nonetheless, what we're seeing is that really 2/3 of organizations are still planning to return to the workspace. So if you take Deloitte kind of at face value, what we're doing in essence is kind of following the executive called return to work, and maybe not entirely listening to the employees' different needs. And with that, I will mention that it is varied. Right, so not all work from home experiences have been created equal. Now, before I get too far down the path, the girl on the right there is my daughter. That's Becca, and Becca is a recent graduate from the University of Delaware. I will say, in fact, I spent last weekend moving Becca from the Boston area down to her first fourth floor walk up in Manhattan. And, so even as I'm sitting here talking to you, I think my knees are barking at me a little bit. I actually put Becca on this slide with a purpose, though, right? Because I think that when we start to think about employees, we have a tendency to think of our employees and our people that are working in our organization as homogenous, and that's dangerous. In fact, while most employees have actually had better than expected experiences in the work from home environment, both being more productive and actually being able to spend more time, sometimes like family activities, that's not universal. A lot of folks are complaining about the overwork, confusion, a lot of living situation challenges. The entry-level employee, and that is Becca in a nutshell, are likely to say that that are less likely to say that remote work has gone better. So in other words, when I have anecdotal conversations with my daughter, she genuinely wishes she could be in an in-office work environment because she would like to have that social interaction as she gets started with her career. Now, employees with dependents are a little bit more excited to return to the office. And those, by the way, those dependents, when we kind of uncover that, they're both, the young kids, and in some cases also, employees who are maybe helping to take care of an elderly member of their family as well. But, that mixing in that case has made it a little bit more challenging for some employees. So we have a group of employees that really want to go back. We have another group of employees that are maybe not too thrilled. So for any of you folks, by the way, who are interested in kind of bringing your entry-level employees in and making sure that they have a good experience, the tips from Beck are as follows. My daughter, by the way, is, despite looking like the cheerleader, is definitely a foodie. So snacks, catered lunch, cold brew on tap with oat milk, and maybe a weekly happy hour for socialization are her recommendations. So, I'm sure on top of anything else I would say about process automation and the things that we need to do in order to make ourselves viable, at least I've given you one good solid tip you can take away today. So the pressure to get this right is very, very high. And I'm probably not telling you much that you haven't seen anecdotally, but let's take it all together and kind of put it into its own little mixing bowl. When we talk about getting this wrong, when we talk about not providing the experience that maybe folks with dependents want, or folks who are not wanting to go to work because they don't have that need and are feeling like that they can save themselves commute time that they want, you got to consider that because employee mobility is at an all-time high. Now, I didn't see last month's numbers, but up until last month, some of the employee mobility numbers were the highest on record. So people are leaving jobs in droves, and I'm sure most of you folks have seen evidence of the Great Resignation as well. And I was literally flipping through LinkedIn because I too recently changed jobs. And on that, I noticed that there was probably 10, 15 people that I know from a few years in the industry that have also shifted roles as well. Now, at the same time, when we think about the processes that we need in order to kind of put things in place so that you can at least have in-office options as an option, we see that that's happening against a lot of change as well. So, for instance, the fluid regulations you guys see here. Now, there were some cases in my area where the entirety of a police force had to be vaccinated. And that meant, of course, tracking whether they were vaccinated. There have been other cases where, in the backdrop of making sure that, say, everybody had to be vaccinated by regulation, by local regulation, that some of those things were recently overturned in the Supreme Court. So, my point is, I think a lot of things are being tried, a lot of things are being changed. And now, on top of that, we've got, new guidelines coming up. And those new guidelines are coming up because, as you folks know, we've had new strains. Omicron ran through, the United States and frankly the world, really around the turn of the year, the calendar year. But now we've got a new strain coming up. And even as the guidelines were starting to shift and relax, it's entirely possible these guidelines will again change. And maybe, things like longer isolation times or longer quarantine times could come back into effect as well. Mask mandates might come back into effect as well. When we look at those guidelines and the fact that they're always changing, that means that we as a company also have to change with them. I mean, obviously there might be new reporting that needs to happen in the context of mask wearing. Again, Boston recently relaxed all the mask wearing mandates as the Omicron numbers came down. But now that the next strain is starting to come, that might shift. That might therefore mean that companies have to make sure that they have good processes in place for buying masks, as well as cleaning and so forth. So my point is that all of this is happening at once, and we really need to get this right. Now, how do we cross this chasm? And let me actually take one step back. Part of the right answer when we start to look at the mix of people and the different desires is to make sure that we have options for everybody. In fact, look, I think most of us have talked a little bit about, sorry folks, most of us have talked about, hybrid as a work option. And I think that that is something that's clearly taking effect. But I think what we're seeing is that that is now going to become the predominant way that people deal with this work at home, not work at home. Now, clearly, that's going to vary by industry. If you're in manufacturing and you need to have people on the floor working the shift, that's going to be less of an option for you. But even there, what we see is that there are certain roles, maintenance roles, for instance, that some of which can be done a little bit more remotely, and so that maybe that mix is going to shift. But a couple of processes that we might think, and this is based off of some of the OSHA guidelines that have developed in the wake of COVID, are vaccination tracking. I think a lot of us have seen that. What's interesting, and I'll show you this here in a minute, is that's not as universal as some of us in kind of the professional sphere would assume. There's some vaccination tracking and not always. Incident reporting, and communication is pretty big, particularly in some of the manufacturing environments or some of the retail environments where we get clusters of people together. Physical distancing and workspace concentration. Many areas of the country have some regulations in place for how much capacity you can fill. And obviously, I think we've all been exposed to the 6 feet of distance at all times. PPE ordering and distribution, I was just talking about masks. I think that's kind of coming there. And then, of course, cleaning and disinfection. These are the things that, from an OSHA perspective, that we're recommending that people do. Now, by the way, folks, I pared this down a little bit to spare us a list of 13. But of those 13, a lot of these were kind of clustered around these 5. These are sort of the main ones. And the nice thing is, people are moving in this way. Companies are actually implementing countermeasures. And so we do see, masks and social distancing, kind of related on the last one, enhanced health and safety protocols for distancing and notification, adherence to quarantine procedure, daily health certifications are becoming really quite large, right? So masks and social distancing are almost universal. Some of the others are a little less. Proof of COVID-19 testing and vaccination. Really, actually, only about 1 in 10 companies are doing that right now, according to Deloitte. And this was kind of late in 2021. So do kind of consider this still pretty current. Nonetheless, I think that, the fact that we're seeing this movement at all across all these fronts does say that companies are taking this seriously. And that they're kind of moving in that direction. But, okay, so we've talked about that. And, the question then becomes, particularly in light of the conference topic, in other words, we're talking about digital operation, digital transformation, right? And how are we able to do that? Can we be flexible, right? Can we adapt with flexibility? Well, as it turns out, and this varies again by industry, but we kind of go across. About 80% of companies have some sort of digital transformation project, but very few of those are actually done at scale across the organization. So 67% have either no plans, about a third, or have just 1 or 2, business processes in pilot mode. Only about a third of folks actually can scale their business processes. And that what's happening at the end of the day is that when we actually talk about implementing business processes, and we'll get under the cover a little bit of what I mean by business processes here in a minute. But when we do that, most folks are still doing this mostly in a manual way. Now, when I say manual, that might mean literally manual. It might mean that, we're kind of documenting what business process we have on a spreadsheet, doing our best to maybe, throw up a form or something, or still maybe doing it via paper. There's some of that. We also, though, might be referring to kind of using a set of coders that we have in the back, in the IT space, right? There are app dev professionals who are actually some of our most expensive and scarcest resource in our company. So if we're doing that and we're trying to actually get these critical business processes up, are we going to achieve it, or is it going to be slow? In fact, what we need to be thinking about is how we adapt to these unexpected challenges. In other words, we know we're going to have future regulation changes. I can almost guarantee that OSHA is going to shift some guidance sometime in the next 6 months, much less the CDC and how long we have to keep people quarantined or isolated in the wake of an infection. And so what we need to get to is a state of permanent flexibility, where when something changes and we have a new need, we can adapt quickly. But we're not there yet. And in fact, I think that what we're doing here is setting the stage for this need for process automation. The process automation can help organizations drive to permanent flexibility so that we can improve the employee experience, maximize productivity, but also create an environment that adapts to the overarching needs of the employees. So if we have work from home employees with a set of processes that they need, we have that available. If we have another set of processes that we need for people who are returning to work and in the office, that's available as well. So again, when I say traditional approach, what we're talking about is manual, relying on very few people to kind of make changes. So that means as a result that when we look at the process, discovering and mapping those processes is very, very challenging, because we have processes that are spread out across the organization, they're siloed, that can make them difficult to document because we have tribal knowledge in a number of different places and little standardization across that process. There's a restrictive approach to automation. In other words, again, relying on very few application development engineers, if you will. And that means that we rely heavily on coding and bespoke app dev skills that start over each time from scratch. So not only is it taking us a while because we have to scope every time and we have to code every time, but rarely, because we have done that from scratch for a customized environment, are we able to repeat that across our organization. So if you are a manufacturing site with multiple facilities, just because you put one set of processes in place doesn't mean you'll be able to kind of drive that elsewhere. The time to value is obviously therefore slow, even cumbersome, maybe multi-month, year-long projects. Again, when you look at that in the context of what's going on from a COVID perspective and returning to work, that's really not good enough. We need to be able to do better. And then finally, it's very difficult to see value from these, costs of consulting, reach of apps, difficult to scale. I think we've covered that. So but what if we could shift that? What if we could kind of make discovery and mapping easy? Collaboratively map, improve, prioritize, and processes. What if we could automate some of those processes so that it's agile? Low code, drag and drop, powerful, a lot of connectors, kind of getting everything in your environment. What if we could improve that time to value so that's fast? You can implement in days to weeks, not months to years. And finally, what if we could actually drive value for this so that it's not only affordable, but creating real value, the low total cost of ownership for your company. Now, this is where Mintex plays, right? But I'd like to talk about this just a little bit more broadly in the context of process automation. Clearly, we feel very good about our platform, but I think actually if I were to leave this conversation with you today and have you looking at the possibility of process automation in general rather than necessarily with Mintex, I'd be very happy. So what you're looking for is something that's easy, powerful, and complete. Something that lets you discover and map business processes with tools, process owners, and participants so you can actually know what's happening today. That you design and automate. Now, there's a couple of interesting things here, I think, when we talk about automation, and because when we think about this design and automate step, some of this is going to adapt to your needs. And I'll show you a few examples here in just a moment. But maybe it's as simple as we need some new forms, right? We need a new form for people who are putting in whether or not they feel well today on a daily basis. Maybe we need a workflow, right? So we're setting up somebody and that needs to go for approval somewhere else. And we need to make sure to capture that in a way that actually tracks that. And also, we there's RPA, so which helps for simple interactions, right? Maybe looking up numbers on the back screen. Usually, when I think of RPA, it's often things like banking, where we're looking up the current rates and so forth. But I think I can see worlds here where we can actually apply this to things like COVID numbers in this space as well. Generating and signing. Perhaps we need to kind of generate a document and even provide the ability to sign electronically that document. For things like certifications, this might be relevant. I certify that I feel fine, and I'm signing accordingly. Or perhaps sometimes we see this quite often in sort of legal space or contract space of a couple of ways as well. And then finally, obviously the analytics that you need in order to kind of automate performance and gain true insight into process intelligence. So this is a full spectrum of what one could do with, platform automation and, process automation, my apologies. But I think what I'd like you to sort of consider is whether or not this could be applicable to your return to work processes. So our customers have been working in this space a lot, right? And I think what we've seen is when we look at across those three areas with employees' opinions and fluid regulations and guidelines, that they're actually applying processes today that address this. So, for instance, employee survey and tracking is one that we saw recently, where we just kind of feeling about whether or not employees are ready to return to the office. Some of the things I think you'd expect to see with regulations, COVID-19 validation, I'm feeling healthy, test result tracking, were both the things that a number of our employees have, or I'm sorry, a number of our customers have actually implemented. And some developing guidelines around travel, and the steps we need to take, steps one needs to take in order to gain access to the facility. In this case, when I looked at this particular customer, they were doing things like making sure that employees had a parking space and were admitted to the garage, and then an assigned desk when they got there. And then obviously incident communication if there's been an outbreak or there's been a problem, making sure that folks know. These are all processes that our customers have been implementing today. And so here's an example of what one might do in light of the desired return to work. It's a simple 4-step process with registration, updating status, daily reminders, and weekly reporting. So again, very simple and straightforward. And so with registration, the process is set up so that the employee registers with a COVID tracking site. He or she enters basic information and vaccination data. There's built-in logic for vaccination that helps determine, the timing on a second shot, need for a second shot, depending on whether or not, the shot itself was, Moderna or Pfizer or obviously J&J, which only requires one. The unique ID is generated, emailed back to the employee, so that the employee then can use that unique ID and update. Right. So for in-process vaccination, then weekly reminders are sent saying, hey, just want you to know that your next vaccination is coming up in a week or two. Now we might also want to update that status. So weekly reminder to update the vaccination status. The employee then follows that unique ID back to the form, enters it, and updates the vaccination status once that second shot has been received or booster shot has been received. For critical employees, we might have daily reminders, right? Update your test results. Well, in this case, the test results are actually the daily testing for COVID when you come in. The employee follows the link just as we did before with the unique ID, and enters it and updates the daily test results. And then finally, and I'd rather than kind of take you through a whole process here, I thought I'd just sort of show you what the vaccination report, the analytics might look like in this case. We might be able to look at the folks who are vaccinated or not vaccinated. We look at negative and positive test results for the daily testing. We can look at that by date. We could actually even kind of check vaccination types and so forth if we wanted to kind of compare that with, say, like positive test results. So it gives you the ability to actually have, good knowledge and visibility to what's going on in your organization, and adapt accordingly. All right, folks. So with that, let me kind of wrap it up with a few key takeaways. It's obvious that the return to work appetite is higher with executives and employees. And at the same time, the ecosystem surrounding COVID-19 is pretty complex. Now, companies need to address these key processes, but they also need to be open to the notion of permanent flexibility. And when I say permanent flexibility, obviously I'm talking about process automation, change those processes, but I'm also, again, going back to the notion of hybrid and making sure you have multiple options on the table for your employees so you can actually hang on to as many of them as possible. And this permanent flexibility is empowered in a lot of respects, enabled by process automation. So Jose, I think that kind of takes me to the end with a thank you. Maybe I'll turn the floor back over to you for some questions.
Terrific, Erik. Thank you so much for that. And I encourage the audience to keep providing submitting your questions. I keep an eye on all of them coming through. So go ahead and submit the questions, and I'll relay them to Erik in real time. Erik, I'm going to ask you to hit the button that says to stop showing your screen so I can bring my camera back on. Perfect. Excellent. So Erik, great background on this return to work phase that we're in, at different levels across multiple industries, and this focus on processes and process automation. It's always challenging because organizations have lots of processes, and deciding which process to automate is a big question. Let me ask you, from your experience, and when organizations do it well, what is the overall approach that they take for process automation? How do they even start identifying the right processes that should be automated? What do you see as best practices out there?
I think there are actually two things that happen, let's just say. One, sometimes I think we are faced with a critical issue. For instance, if we are actually tackling return to work as a core set of things that we need to tackle right now, process is notwithstanding. Just this need to kind of make that happen from the top down in the organization. Quite often we see people kind of start there. Start with something that is glaring and an issue from a business perspective, because the bottom line is that business processes touch everything, right? So we often think of digital transformation in the context of putting better automation on things like our retail or our ability to produce things. But really, at the end of the day, there's a whole lot of glue in our organization that starts with these processes as well. So oftentimes what we're doing is starting on with the processes that are the most mission critical for our company, and kind of expanding out from there. Now, the other thing that we see a little bit is a focus on maybe discovering and mapping. So in other words, if you guys recall these folks, my apologies, recall the spectrum of capabilities I put up there on the very far left, there was discovery and mapping. And, oftentimes I think, or just say the problem that you just relayed is even more of an issue because we don't actually know what those processes are. We don't have a great sense of them. So in some cases, particularly some of the more process driven industries like oil and gas, or I don't know, maybe some of the manufacturing processes, but that have a lot going on. We see companies actually starting by just trying to better understand, right, and then kind of determining which are the most mission critical. So for the top down thinking companies, it probably focuses that way. Probably for the majority, it kind of focuses on the thing that the CEO or the high level executive tried to point us at.
Excellent. Yeah, there are a number of questions related to governance, and people making commentary that digital transformation and automation of processes specifically is challenging because often organizations don't have a clear picture of what they want to achieve. As you mentioned very well, I mean, when it's done well, you have collaboration, at the top levels, and with respect to the organizational strategy and what are maybe the key core processes, value creation processes of the organization, and you focus on that. But quite often it happens in a more ad hoc fashion, where folks in different places in the organization are picking the processes that they believe are most important, and this collaboration can be tricky because the priorities may not be the same. But in so let's talk a little bit about governance. People say that to have good digital transformation, you need to have some sort of governance in place, and governance sounds like a big word, but the gist of it is that how do you make decisions in this organization about the processes that matter the most, and who do you get engaged in that decision? Tell us a little bit about what you see out there in terms of governance for digital transformation. How are organizations, again, setting themselves up to identify and prioritize what could be digitally transformed?
Yeah, Jose, that's a great point. In fact, in my history, we've often called that dynamic last unloudest, right? In other words, in the absence of really good information, we tend to focus on the person who is the loudest or that spoke last with the biggest issue that kind of hit the table. And I think last and loudest is dangerous. Now, from a governance perspective, I think if I were to sort of set the way back stage, we used to see almost all digital transformation processes, whether or not it was kind of more of a process-oriented issue, or I should say digital transformation initiatives, whether it was a process automation issue or something outside of that sphere, were often starting in IT. Now, I mean, this still happens, IT is still involved, but increasingly what we're seeing is a group of folks, maybe, in some cases, folks starting with line of business, making determinations that way. But in a lot of cases, actually, what we're seeing is the emergence of sort of a digital transformation working group, or guiding set of people that are actually helping to drive those decisions. And some of the most successful digital transformation projects that we've seen have had that sort of involvement that leverages both the IT perspective, what works, what doesn't work, what's secure, what's not secure, but also the line of business perspective in terms of what's actually going to drive value for the company. So I think that's kind of, from a governance perspective, is part of the answer. I think the other part of the answer, particularly since I am more interested in process automation, does go back to that whole discovery and mapping. The other issue that's happening that really contributes to this last and loudest dynamic is there's very little understanding of the end-to-end process to begin with. And in essence, we need to have a good, solid understanding of where it is and where it's hanging up, so that we can focus on the thing that actually is causing us the most pain.
Yeah, you touched some very important subjects there, and I'll connect with a question that has come up here during your presentation about the digital transformation tools that you find are being useful and helpful. I mean, of course, you have the suite of tools at Nintex, and you certainly should speak about those as well. But from a practical perspective, let's talk about collaboration specifically. When we talk about digital transformation collaboration, people start talking about typically communication tools like Zoom and Teams and other things that can connect people. And connection is nice and certainly has helped a lot for us to kind of stay in place with the running operations and doing the work we have to do. But there's some sort of consensus that collaboration is still challenging when you're working remotely. So connection is important, but that doesn't mean that you're having great collaboration as a result of that connection. What do you see in terms of beyond the remote tools? What do you see as digital transformation tools that are helping organizations and people and professionals collaborate more effectively? Is there something that Nintex offers that helps with that collaboration aspect? It could be around the process discovery that you discussed, or some other areas about how do people collaborate? Is there a better way of collaborating? And there are any digital tools out there that are helping with that collaboration around processes, around design? What do you see in your practical experience?
Yeah, just say, let me take a little broader approach to that too, if you don't mind. Because I think, you know, we adapted a lot of technology over the course of the last 2.5 years, right? I mean, I am much more comfortable operating in Zoom than I was when I started with the whole COVID dynamic. And without question, we can have meetings and collaborate online. We've gotten better with file sharing kind of documents, about being able to kind of, you know, share documents and work collaboratively that way. Um, some of what I feel happens, and you know, McKinsey's kind of talked about this a little bit, is remember when we start talking about processes and connecting with people, the things we do from a technology perspective are part of it, and the things that we do outside of that. How you doing today? How are how's your family? How's your pet? You know, and spending a little time just kind of talking about things has actually been one of the things that helps drive a lot of collaboration, professionally and otherwise, and kind of ground people during this period. I wanted to say that because I'm going to turn around and start talking about tech again. Um, but at the same time, I think that's an important part of this dynamic, which is to remember that there are people in behind this whole thing. And collaboration happens on a lot of different levels. So, you know, just say your example about, you know, collaboration tools that we've adapted. Teams has seen an uptick. You know, Zoom's seen an uptick. There's been a lot of new collaboration tools for meetings and documents that have kind of made the mainstream of our working sphere. Nintex also contributes to that process. You know, I already talked about discovery and mapping, so I'll stop beating the folks over the head with that. But, you know, we start talking about automating workflows. We're talking about being able to put something in place where a number of people can kind of look at a document, set something in place where you can kind of review it, adapt it, make changes to it. Certainly in the context of like generating forms and approving them and then getting them signed, that markup and collaboration experience is sort of built in there. And, you know, right down to the final authorization and signing of those docs. So, you know, we in essence have a good set of capabilities for being able to work on things together, even if you're not looking at somebody face to face. But, you know, that's part of it. But again, you know, as I was just saying before, remember there's also sort of, you know, a process thing that is about your company and culture, and recognizing that and making sure that you're kind of implementing around that. Trying to put good human characteristics in your interactions is probably a good thing too.
Well said, Erik. I think that too often we are focusing on the technology and the tool and bypass some of the items, the human side items that you just discussed, which are incredibly important. And at a broader level, collaborative leadership itself, it's a skill set that's not very well understood. A lot of how collaborative a session has to do with how it's facilitated and how you engage others. Professionally, but as you said very well, personally as well, making that emotional connection with people is important. Now, what do you see as the biggest opportunity from a digital transformation perspective with organizations? I mean, you work with clients of all different sizes in different industries, and I know it's hard to say that this is one thing, but overall, as you, especially as people start returning to work and digital transformation is going beyond just remote access and collaboration, what do you see as in most organizations as a good starting point for their digital transformation? So maybe folks who have not engaged meaningfully yet on the work process digital transformation side, how do they even get started? How would you guide them to get started on the right foot?
You know, to say it's a great question. There's a lot of paper out there, folks. You know, this is something that I actually have some background in manufacturing, which is why occasionally as I'm trying to flip through examples as we speak, I almost automatically go to manufacturing sites and all that kind of stuff because, you know, I know it quite well. But one of the things that I've noticed actually is I've kind of taken on different roles that are a little bit broader is, I should say And in manufacturing, there's a lot of paper. You know, you don't think of it, right? But there's paper that you use kind of as you're transferring from shifts, and there's paper that you use often actually for assembling different parts, depending on the type of manufacturing you do. But I was shocked actually at how much paper there is everywhere. You know, retail, we have a lot of paper. Local government, I'm looking out of my window here at Gloucester, Massachusetts City Hall. There's a ton of paper there. And we have had the tendency to just kind of walk things down the hall and, you know, make sure that, you know, that Bob or Jane actually signs that, and walk it over to some other area. And that's, in essence, the de rigueur standard that we've operated our businesses on for 40, 50 years. But that itself is a good place to start, because that paper is inherently inefficient. And if you are focusing on the biggest areas of paper buildup, you might actually be looking at processes that could use a little bit of attention, with process mapping and process automation, and then obviously forms generation to help make that more efficient and more nimble, so that you can make changes in the face of, you know, something that's happening in your environment, and, you know, move forward efficiently.
Well said, well said. And one final question here from the audience that I'm going to capture. The main theme has to do with different levels of digital transformation across industries. You're in a privileged position because you see, you know, many different industries and clients from those different industries. And I don't know if you have an overall assessment of that. Are there industries that are leaders or laggards when it comes to digital transformation that you're seeing currently? As a group, are there industries that are further ahead for whatever reason and they're doing better than other industries? I mean, is there, if you look at it in the spectrum, is there such a thing when it comes to digital transformation implementation?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Digital transformation initiatives have not been applied evenly across industry. There's no question about that. We've seen a lot of implementation of like process-oriented digital transformation in, you know, retail, and actually local government has been picking up, although they're behind in the digital transformation efforts overall. But just in general, digital transformation, I think what we've seen is retail is been a pretty big leader in terms of like the interfaces that we use to shop with, as well as kind of some of the online things that we do. So some of that's been quite innovative. There's been a lot of laggards in here though too. You know, I was just doing a talk with some of the oil and gas folks a few weeks ago, and that's lagging by about, you know, 20 points in terms of people that are taking on digital transformation initiatives. And I think the other thing I would caution, you know, leader laggard, you know, overall about 80% of companies have digital transformation initiatives in place. In manufacturing, that can be as high as 95. That doesn't necessarily mean that manufacturing is doing that at scale, or that you know, some of the other industries like retail that has, you know, kind of in the 80s as well, is doing that at scale, right? So there's a lot of room for growth across industry, and certainly some variation in terms of what's going on in general. Nonetheless, I do personally believe that digital transformation is something that can benefit just about anyone from the company perspective.
Erik, thank you so much for that. Just one final note here. What is the best way for folks to connect with you, learn about what's going on in Intex and the support that you're providing across industries for digital transformation?
By all means, I think, I'm sorry, you're not seeing my screen, but erik.hille@nintex.com. That's Erik with a K, and Hille is Hille. I'd be more than happy to take questions or comments. I can be found on LinkedIn at Erik.Hille there as well.
Outstanding. Erik, thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your wisdom, your cross-industry expertise with all of us today. And we've learned some useful practical insights here that can help us all in our own digital transformation. So thank you for taking the time.
It's my pleasure, Joseph. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time as well.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Erik Hille, who is the Director of Solutions Marketing at Nintex, sharing his cross-industry journey of digital transformation with us. We're going to be taking a break now, and at the top of the hour, we're going to bring Weston Morris to share with us the secret to great employee experiences in 2022 and how digital transformation is impacting that employee experience in 2022. Weston Morris is the global strategy and digital workplace services leader for Unisys Corporation, and he is going to be discussing how the digital workplace transformation is shaping itself at Unisys with us. So take a break now. We are going to be back at the top of the hour with Weston Morris.